Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the Haydn Symphony Crusade, number 35, in B-flat major. This is really an extraordinary symphony, and I know I say that about every symphony, but there's something about this one that I think marks something of a milestone in Haydn's symphonic career. He composed it in 1767. We actually have the date. I think the date was December 1st, 1767, that he completed it. And it's scored for the normal orchestra of, two oboes, two horns, a bassoon on the bottom, strings, and an unnecessary harpsichord if you decide to use one. And that's basically all it has. But it has a few unique timbral features. The horns are in B-flat alto. That means high, the high octave in the key of B-flat, which gives an extraordinary level of tension to the orchestral sonority when those horns are pushed up onto those high notes within the context either of a solo or all together when the orchestra is playing. So that gives the symphony a special sound. And as always, as we've pointed out in this series, these timbral issues, these special sounds are binding ideas that unify the symphony into a special whole. There are movements from this piece. You listen to it, you go, aha, that's number 35, and it can't be number 34, and it can't be number 36. It has to be 35. But more than that, what makes this symphony, well, there are two things that make this symphony so extraordinary. The first is Haydn's method of symphonic working, motivic working, that is in this symphony carried to a level that is of a sophistication and subtlety and brilliance that nobody else was matching. I mean, frankly, Mozart never did it. Beethoven, maybe, but not even as well as often as not. I mean, this is an amazing piece of musical thinking. And if a symphony is became the idea of taking some basic material and revealing all of the expressive possibilities inherent in it that we don't realize at first, but only are gradually revealed over the course of a movement, then boy, this is actually an iconic work. It tells us what a symphony is supposed to be. And all of the movements are related by the similar process that Haydn used. And the process is very simple. I mean, it's very straightforward. It's what Haydn makes of it that's so amazing. The process is taking simple, tiny little motives of just a couple of notes, 3 notes, 4 notes here or there, and then constantly transforming them expressively into melodies of every conceivable size and shape, and taking those melodies and ideas and running them through different keys, happy, sad, and everything in between. And every movement does it, but does it in a slightly different way or with a slightly different motive, so that as a piece, as a conception, the entire symphony sounds like everything is related to everything else, but you can't put your finger on why, because there are no two themes that are identical. It's constantly evolving. And that's what's so wonderful about Haydn. And one of the things that people, I think, often get wrong with Haydn, particularly when we're taught, and we've been talking about this, the textbook idea of sonata form, particularly in these movements that have an exposition that presents the themes, usually 2 of them, or 2 ideas, and then a development section that develops the themes, and then a recapitulation that repeats the themes all in the same key, whereas they changed key originally. That's the textbook of sonata form. And Haydn follows it sort of, kind of. I mean, Haydn invented it. So sometimes he's there and sometimes he isn't. But what's much more important than figuring out the formal divisions with Haydn is that his music usually begins developing from the first bar. To say that there's a separate development section is so inappropriate when we're talking about Haydn's music, because he's always evolving things and spinning things out right from the start. And this symphony is an absolutely ideal example of that. And I'm going to let you figure out what happens in a lot of it, because I'm only playing you expositions. I'm not playing you developments and recapitulations. I don't think we need to, because what I want you to listen to in the expositions is the idea of the development of the basic motive, because it starts right at the beginning. And you don't have to wait for the section called development to hear what happens to them, these ideas. They're always being churned around. And that's what makes Haydn so wonderful to listen to. But that's also why I believe he's not quite as popular sometimes as like Mozart or Beethoven, because his music requires, I think, more active listening. I really think that, because his ideas, his musical ideas tend to be short. They tend to be very quickly stated. The music is moving constantly, and it's always in a state of ferment. And that kind of idea of ferment this is a fermented symphony. It ferments. It really does. It bubbles with life. All the little, you might call the little motivic cells the yeast. And the yeasty beasties, as we used to call them, are feeding on the musical sugar, and the dough is rising, and this analogy is being extended well beyond its useful life. But that's what happens in this piece. And so I want you to listen to the exposition of the first movement. And it's all based on this opening phrase. Now, the opening phrase is, ya dum ba da da. It's very graceful. The music seems to have not a care in the world, but it has all of this latent energy that gets unleashed in surprising places. So you've got ya dum ba da da, ya da 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 dum. But the motive that Haydn's going to work with is these last three notes. Da da dum, just da da dum, the little three notes. And you can, sometimes it's dum ba da dum. It can have four notes, you can be three notes, but every significant idea except one in this movement has those three notes at the end of whatever tune or motive or whatever you call it, theme that Haydn creates. And you just never know how it's going to turn up or what shape it's going to take, but it's always there. And so I want you to listen to the exposition, and I want you to listen to the second subject. The second subject is not that. It's the only part of the movement that does not have some obvious derivation from da-da-da. In fact, it's an even rhythm with string tremolos. It's and it sort of goes off the rails a little bit. I mean, you'll know it when you hear it. Just listen to the buzzing strings, and you'll hear it immediately. And of course, it's deliberate. Haydn does that so that there's contrast, so that the movement is not simply a monotonous and endless repetition of things that go da-da-da. Otherwise, it would be. And it's a marvelous thing. It just emphasizes and highlights the very close thematic workmanship that typifies the movement as a whole. So let's play the exposition. This is on Naxos with Nicholas Ward and the Northern Chamber Orchestra. It's a very good performance. And just don't worry about like form in large. Today we're listening to form writ small till we get to the finale. Then something miraculous is going to happen. So here is the first movement exposition, and just listen for those three notes. Da-dum, ba-da-dum, da-da-dum. Listen to that, and all the things that Haydn makes of it. It's amazing. because this is Haydn, the development spends a lot of time in dangerous minor keys. It takes on quite a tragic cast as Haydn continues to work with that motive. And the recapitulation, the restatement, is extremely heavily recomposed. And it's recomposed basically because Haydn has already done so much with this little thing that he doesn't want to go back and just repeat it exactly as it happened at the beginning. He continues to work with it all the way through the movement. You might say, the movement has definite moments of departure from the home key and turmoil or developmental sort of episodes and then a return. But that return isn't really firm. You don't really know we're there until we get to that second subject, which is almost a foreign being in the entire fabric of the movement. So that when you get there, you know, finally, yes, we're definitely home, because that second subject is now going to be in the home key. And it's just such a brilliant movement in so many, many ways. And you feel it when you hear it. It's very difficult to describe a movement like this because it's so closely written. It's so intensely written that the music makes its own point much, much better and much more quickly than I can describe it to you. So I'm going to stop with the first movement and let's move on. The second movement is for strings only. It's very, very lovely. It is quite similar to the first movement. In fact, the form is identical, and it also has a three-note motive that gets tossed about. Sometimes it's dum, bum, bum, and sometimes it's dum, bum, bum, bum. There's a million ways that Haydn works with it. And it's very clear when you listen to it that he's using the same technique as in the first movement, but the themes are completely different. He does not quote it, but you get this feeling that it belongs. You get the feeling of belonging. And there are other motivic resemblances between movements that I'm not talking about because I don't want to make it too complicated. This is only an 18-minute symphony. You could write a dissertation on what Haydn does in this symphony. It's so perfectly and carefully shaped. And it sounds completely spontaneous. Nothing sounds studied or stiff, but my God. So I'm going to do the same thing we did with the first movement. We're just going to listen to the exposition, and you will hear Haydn working with a little tiny three-note motive and doing all kinds of things with it. Here is the slow movement, the andante. Now, as I said, the form of this movement is virtually identical with that of the first movement. It has a development section with a lot of minor key operation and an extremely heavily recomposed recapitulation that only finally settles it in the home key towards the end. And it's incredibly effective because it becomes the inevitable outcome of that first movement. And so it goes throughout the symphony. The minuet is based on a different motive, not three notes particularly. It's a squiggle, or something. I don't know what it is. I mean, I'm not going to try and sing it, and I don't have my kazoo with me, so I'm not going to play it. You will hear it. I'm going to play with the complete A section of the minuet without repeats, and you will hear. It's all built out of the same little motive. And, but the tunes are completely different. And minuet-like, and like all of Haydn's symphonic minuets, you can't possibly dance to this piece because the rhythms don't work. The rhythms are tricky. The rhythms are unexpected. It's full of subtle little twists and turns that you'll hear as you go and listen to it. So let's do a bit of the minuet, and then we have to have a serious talk about this finale because it is a landmark in the history of musical form and content. And we're going to have a great time dealing with it. So I want to get to the finale. In some ways, it's the most important movement in the symphony, which in itself is kind of historical. So let's go back and listen to the entire minuet. You ready? Here it is. You heard the little motive that the whole minuet is based on? I'm sure you did. You can't miss it, unless you didn't listen to the minuet at all. Now the finale. Now, up until this point, many of Haydn's symphonic finales, not all, but most of them, are these sort of rollicking, sea chanty, very short 2 minutes, 2.5 minute things. And they are delightful. I mean, and some are extremely sophisticated. They really are. But this finale does something really, really important. And I'll tell you exactly what it is. It's so simple. One of the things we've noticed and talked about is that outer movements particularly, or movements in sonata form, usually have two halves, both of them repeated. Now, up until rather recently, up until the period instrument movement really got going, we didn't listen to all of the repeats. I mean, they just weren't played. And that's kind of a shame sometimes. Sometimes it's not. The first movement, for example, has two halves. The first half is the exposition. The second half is the development and recapitulation combined. Those are the two halves. And, for example, this very performance does not repeat the second half of the first movement or the second half of the finale. I don't think so. Or maybe it does. Anyway, never mind. But the point is that it's always optional. That's why I never remember whether people do it or not most of the time. These second half repeats, they're hard to justify because on the one hand, we talk about sonata form and this sonata style being a dramatic style that has a very linear progression from a home through a development to a return home. And then you're supposed to go back to the middle and then return home again. It's a difficult concept to integrate into our normal feeling of what sonata form is supposed to be. And Haydn was probably the first composer, definitely the first composer, let's say definitely, even though you would have to listen to everything ever written in order to say that, but I'm going to say it, who actually made his second half repeats matter. There are some movements in which you must play them because the point of the music is that second half repeat. And this is a remarkable thing. It's a remarkable thing in that the form is whole. It's not detachable parts. And this finale has that going for it. So I have to play you the whole finale. I can't just play the exposition. You have to hear how the whole thing works out. It's only about 3.5 minutes, but you got to hear the whole thing. Now, to begin with, the finale begins with a 3-note motive. Bum, bum, bum. It's a really simple motive. It also has little 2-note motives that are, you'll hear all of the motivic working that Haydn's been doing through the whole symphony, he does in this finale. But the key is that those opening 3 notes, bum, 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 are also the ending of the whole symphony. Bum, 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 just like that. This means that when Haydn takes that second half repeat at the very end, you don't know that the end is really the end. And when he goes back to the beginning of the development and plays it all over again, you don't know that he's done that. And as a consequence, we have no idea where we are in this movement. You know, sonata form movements, generally, one of the most amazing things about it is you almost always know where you are, whether you're at the beginning, the middle, or the end, because the music tells you it's starting to wrap up, it's building to a climax, it's heading in this direction. But in this finale, Haydn completely upsets your expectations. It could go on forever. It could just go round and round and round and round, and you would never know. You would never know when it's really going to end until it does. And then when it does, you go, oh my, it's a surprise. The ending is a surprise. But it's satisfying too. That's the point. It's not an open-ended ending. It's a very final ending. It sounds totally logical, but only in retrospect. Only after you've heard it and the music simply has stopped. You go, oh, wow. You may notice that the development and recapitulation are being played again. You may not, but you will not know, I guarantee it, when you've gone back for the second half repeat. There is nothing formulaic about it. It's an entirely integrated whole from beginning to end, and this is something that Mozart never did, particularly, and it's something that even Beethoven had trouble dealing with. Some of Beethoven's exposition repeats are just horrible. I mean, some of his repeats are, like, the worst is probably the first movement of the 7th Symphony by Beethoven, you know, where it's just going like gangbusters, and it stops and it goes back to beep, bitty, beep, bitty, beep, bitty, beep, bitty, beep, bitty, beep. You're just like, why? I mean, if the music wasn't so gorgeous, the tune's so terrific, you'd get angry that it went back and repeated it all over again. It all seems to be so unnecessary. But Haydn wanted everything to be necessary. And what makes a great symphonist is that idea of necessity, that the music must be this way and not any other way. And finales are always a problem. They became an even bigger problem in the Romantic period, when composers were scratching their heads going, oh, how am I going to wrap this up? What am I going to do? How do I recapture the energy of the first movement? Most of the time they didn't or couldn't. But with Haydn, he has solved, with the symphony, any possible problem with the finale. It's a pity nobody else paid attention to what he was doing, because this is a perfectly strict finale formally. It's A, B, B. It's 2 parts, both repeated, 2 halves. But those repeats are completely integral to the music's message and part of the fun. If you leave out the repeat, the movement doesn't work. You have to do it. And that's what makes Haydn such an amazing symphonic genius. Well, one of the things. Anyway, so let's listen to the whole finale. Let me shut up and play you the whole finale. This is so cool. Listen to this. I hope you agree that that is as marvelous a movement as I believe it to be. It is so clever and witty and amusing, and it just makes you feel good. And I can listen to it 100,000 times, and it always makes the effect. Even when you know what's coming because you know it by heart, it still gets the job done. And that is the hallmark of true genius and amazing compositional craft. So, I hope you've enjoyed this little survey of Symphony No. 35. Really a landmark symphony in so many ways. So even though no one ever plays it, nobody cares, and I don't know if anybody even realizes half the time just what amazing trails this music is blazing. It is astonishing music. And I hope you just go off and listen to it on your own and really give it some deep listening. It's 18 minutes. Listen to it 3 times in an hour. Seriously. Give it some serious listening, because it will open up a whole different world of music to you and a whole different way of listening and receiving musical information, which is, of course, emotional expression. And it will make your whole experience of listening to music just deeper and more rewarding. I guarantee it. So keep on listening, folks. Thanks so much for joining me for the Haydn Symphony Crusade. Take care.